Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Almost Daily Bible Studies. This series that we're doing on Saturday is on creation out of Genesis 1 and 2. And so we started this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And so we want to go back and review a little bit, just a little bit, and then get into some new material as well after I get everything set and reset and everything else where it needs to be. So if you want to get a Bible, turn to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and we'll be looking at that in just a second. And so, one thing that an issue that comes up with Genesis 1 and 2 is, of course, are the days literal? Is the account intended to be taken literally? Lots of different views and ideas and suggestions about that. My feeling is that it is to be taken literally, that Genesis is patently historical. It's intended to be taken historically. And that if we don't take Genesis as an historical account from the very beginning, then where do we begin to take it historically? If the creation isn't literal, are Adam and Eve literal? If they're not literal, or Cain and Abel literal? If they're not literal, Tower of Babel, if it isn't. So where does it begin to be literal? And why do we have to take anything literally? Why can't Jesus be figurative, or the apostles be figurative, or whatever? So I believe there is literal. I believe in six 24-hour days of creation, and then a day of rest, and everything in that early account is literal. Remember the days of creation. The first day was the light separated from darkness, creation of light and separation from darkness. And then there was the creation on day 2 of the expanse, the space between the waters below, rivers, what would become rivers and oceans and seas from the waters above, which would be clouds. And so there's the upper atmosphere, and then a space, and then there's the water below. And then on day 3, the waters were gathered and the dry land appeared along with vegetation. On day 4, the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, the sea and the sky animals, fish and whales and that sort of thing, and the birds, the things that fly in the air. And then on day 6, land animals and man. And then, of course, the day of rest, day 7. So remember that each of the first days prepares for each of the first 3 days prepares for each of the last 3 days. And so there's the creation of light on day 1, the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. Day 4, we'll talk about that in a minute. The expanse created to create the waters below and the waters above. And then on day 5, to correspond to that, we have the animals created for the sea and the animals created for the sky. And then in day 3, we have the gathering of waters, the appearance of dry land and vegetation. And then on day 6, the creation of land animals and man. And we notice the repeated emphasis on the idea of separation. And we'll talk more about that as we go along today. So let's look at day 1, which is the separation of light from darkness. Day 1, Genesis chapter 1, the separation of light from darkness. And so Moses tells us that in verse 3, then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Uh, and there was evening and morning one day. And so here again, notice that God does two things. He creates light, and he separates light from darkness. Um, what he's creating here is light with no physical light source. He's not going to create physical light sources until day 4, sun, moon, and stars. At this point, he simply creates light as a thing. Light is just there, it just exists. There's just light. And because there's light, then it's separated from darkness. Now, the darkness here and the light are literal. Um, on day 1 of creation, there really was a real light, and there really was real darkness, but they're also symbolic. And so, what we want to remember as we go through this account, and indeed all of the book of Genesis and all of the first 5 books of the Bible, is that they're being written by Moses to prepare the people to enter the land of Canaan. And so, what I do when I read Genesis and all the 5 books of Moses is to repeatedly ask myself, What does this have to say to the Israelites as they were about to enter the land of Canaan? For instance, another example of that are both Adam and Eve and Cain. When Adam and Eve sinned, they lost their land, right? Adam and Eve had to leave the Garden of Eden. Cain had to leave where he was living and wander around on the face of the earth. And so remember what was the big threat against the Israelites as they were about to enter the land of Canaan. Before they got into the land of Canaan, they were repeatedly told, if you sin, you will lose what? You will lose your land. You will be expelled from your land, as Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, as Cain was expelled from the land that he was living on, and he became a wanderer. And God told the Israelites that, I'll make you wander around, I'll make you be hated, I'll make you fear for your life, I'll make you be persecuted. That's exactly what what happened to Cain and what he feared. So everything that we look at in these books it's there because it's historical, but it's there because it has something specific to say to the Israelites before they enter the land of Canaan. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. So when God talks about light and darkness on day one, even though they're both literal, he really created light and separated it from literal darkness. What else is he saying? Well, he's saying that when God is apart, when God is not involved in something, it's dark, it's chaotic. We know that throughout the Bible, we'll talk about this in a minute, that darkness is repeatedly used to talk about what is apart from God, and it's sinful, it's wicked, it's full of fear, it's full of problems, it's chaos. But when God gets involved, there's light, and there is blessing, there's growth, there's life, and all of those things. And so it's important to keep in mind what the Israelites were to be taking from this. What did they need to know about light and darkness? Well, they're about to enter Canaan, and Canaan was a place of great darkness. Canaan was a place of great wickedness, great sin and chaos and violence and all sorts of things that we associate with sexual immorality and things that ignorance of the truth that we associate with darkness. And so God is telling the Israelites, you're light. And they were told that in the Old Testament, that they were to be a light. And when they entered Canaan, they were to keep their light shining and to be separate from the darkness. On day one, God created the light and separated it from the darkness. Israel was a creation of God. They were to be light, and they were to be separate from the darkness. So there's that idea of separation again. It means complete incompatibility. And so we see throughout the Bible this idea of light and darkness. We see when we look at the idea of light and darkness, we see in Isaiah 5:20, we see Isaiah, or God through Isaiah, pronouncing woe on those who call light darkness, or who substitute darkness for light. And we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, when Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to stay totally away from false teachers and false teaching, he says, what fellowship does darkness have with light? There is no fellowship. If something it is light, if there's light, then there's not darkness. I mean, I've got a light above me and that I use for my videos, and when that light is on, there can be no darkness right here. If I turn it off and turn off the other light and black out the window and turn the light off over there, there will be darkness here. But because there's light, the darkness is eliminated. They're incompatible. You can't have them both at the same time. One of the interesting things to notice too is how John uses this imagery in both the Gospel of John and the letter of 1 John. In the Gospel, and in both of them, John begins with the beginning, right? He says in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 1, he says what was from the beginning. And so in the beginning, in John, in the Gospel of John, he means the beginning of creation. In the first letter of John, he means the beginning of the kingdom, the ministry of Christ, the beginning of what Jesus was doing. But he intentionally uses, in the Gospel of John and the first letter of John, he intentionally uses that in the beginning idea to take us back to creation. And we know that when we read John 1 1 to 15 or 14, when we read 1 John 1 1 to 7, we know that John, having started with this in the beginning idea or from the beginning, he almost immediately starts using this imagery of light. John does the same thing that Moses does. He starts in the beginning and he immediately begins to talk about light. And of course, that's one of the big ideas, one of the big concepts and themes in all the writings of John is the idea of light and darkness. It's just constantly through the writings of John, but through the Bible as a whole. And of course, the ultimate application of that is that Jesus is the light of the world. John 8 and verse 12, Jesus is the light of the world. And throughout the gospel, it's talked about his ministry in terms of walking in the light, as long as we walk in the light and all that. And so that's the light and the darkness. The second day then is tells us about the separation of waters by the expanse. And so he says in verse 6, then God said, let there be an expanse. Again, the King James, I think, is a little misleading here. Just because it uses the word firmament, and firmament to me, I see the word firm and I think something that's solid. In fact, it means space. It means something where there isn't anything physical or solid. So God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters below the expanse from the waters above the expanse, and it was so. He called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and morning a second day. So when he makes this separation, there were waters above, which is the clouds and the water in the upper atmosphere, and then there was the water below, which will become rivers, oceans, and that sort of thing. Again, notice the idea of separation. The Israelites are to be separate from Canaan. We're to be separate from the world. We're going to talk more about in fact, we'll go ahead and do that now. And notice the constant theme of separation in the Bible. The Israelites, the immediate idea was that the Israelites were to be separate from the Canaanites. They were to have nothing to do with them. In fact, they were to annihilate them and have nothing to do with anything that they did, believed, thought, practiced, said. They would just have total separation. Christians, of course, are to be separate from the world. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 17, God says, come out from their midst and be separate. In Hades, there is a separation. Luke 16, beginning in verse 19, tells us that in Hades, there's a separation between those who are in torment and those who are in what Jesus would call paradise, in the good part of Hades. And they're separated, remember, by that chasm between the two that prevents anybody from going across. There's total separation. Once we die and go to Hades, there's total separation, and it can never be mixed or undone or joined together. At the judgment in Matthew 25, Jesus said that he will separate the sheep from the goats. He will separate those on his right from those on his left. And so at the judgment, and then of course in eternity, there will be a separation between those who are lost, who will be in hell, and those who are saved, who will be in heaven. And so throughout the Bible, there is this emphasis over and over and over on separation. And it's almost as if God knew, it's almost as if God knew that this is something that he was going to need to emphasize, because in our world, the idea of separation is to be denied. It's rejected. The idea that there's any separation between people, that there's any difference, that there's any acceptable and not acceptable, that there's any right or wrong, that there's any saved or unsaved, is just increasingly rejected and hated by the world that we live in. And yet throughout the Bible, it's this constant theme of separation from the left and the right, the light and the dark, the good and the bad, the moral and the immoral, believers and unbelievers, heathen and and the saved, and all of those things. And so it's just really important to notice what a big theme that is, and always to be biblically solid on that, and really know and understand, believe, and never compromise on that idea that there really is a separation between those who are lost and those who are saved. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave it right there for now. And Lord willing, next Saturday, we'll get into the dry land and the vegetation. We'll get into the creation of light sources, and not only notice the literal historical things that happened in that, but we'll also notice the application of that, the spiritual truths behind it. So I hope this is helpful. Please share this video. That's really, really, it does make a difference. I don't just ask you to do that for, for no good reason, but it really does make a difference if you'll share the video, if you'll like it, if you'll leave me a comment, that would be great. And hope we'll be talking again real soon.